The silver brand hanging between her collarbones caught the midday sun as Rebecca Torres stepped off the stagecoach into Julian, California. And for the first time in 3 months, she allowed herself to breathe without the weight of fear crushing her lungs. The year was 1878, and the small mining town nestled in the Cuyamaca Mountains looked nothing like the flat, unforgiving plains of Texas, where her father had built an empire on the backs of cattle and the broken spirits of anyone who dared cross him. She pressed her palm against the chain, feeling the raised edges of the circle brand through her threadbare gloves, a reminder of the promise she had made to herself in the dark hours before she fled. She would never belong to any man the way her father had tried to sell her like livestock. "Miss, your trunk." The driver's gruff voice pulled her from her thoughts, and she turned to see him hefting her single piece of luggage onto the dusty street. Everything she owned in the world fit into that battered leather case, a far cry from the dozen steamer trunks that had once filled her bedroom in the ranch house outside San Antonio. "Thank you." She pressed a coin into his weathered palm and tried not to think about how few remained in her purse. The journey from Texas had consumed most of the money she had stolen from her father's safe, the same safe where she had found the brand that now hung against her heart. It had belonged to her mother. He had told her once in a rare moment of drunken sentimentality, before his first wife had died bringing Rebecca into the world. What he had not told her was why her mother wore another man's ranch brand like a wedding ring, or why that brand belonged to a spread called the Silver Spur Ranch, owned by a family named Sterling. Rebecca had spent weeks piecing together the truth from old letters hidden in her mother's things, letters that spoke of a love affair that had ended when Rebecca's grandfather had forced his daughter into marriage with the wealthiest rancher in 3 counties. The brand had been a promise, those letters said, one that her mother had worn until her dying day. Now Rebecca wore it, not as a symbol of ownership, but as a map leading her to the only family she had left in the world, her mother's true love and the son he had raised without ever knowing that somewhere in Texas he had a daughter who shared his blood. The Silver Spur Ranch lay 20 miles north of Julian, according to the clerk at the general store, and the Sterling family still ran it, though the old man had passed on 5 years back. His son ran the operation now, a man named Yates Sterling, who had earned a reputation as fair but firm, the kind of rancher who paid his hands on time and never asked them to do anything he would not do himself. The clerk had looked at Rebecca with curious eyes when she asked her questions, taking in her travel-stained dress and the determined set of her jaw, but he had been kind enough not to pry. She found a room at the boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Chen, whose husband had come to California during the gold rush and stayed for the mountains and the clean air. The room was small but clean, with a window that overlooked the main street and the San Diego River Valley beyond. Rebecca unpacked her few belongings and laid out her mother's letters on the narrow bed, reading them again by lamplight as the sun set over the mountains. The words were worn soft from handling, but they still carried the weight of desperate love and crushing regret. "I will wear your brand until I die," her mother had written in the last letter, dated just weeks before Rebecca was born. "Let it remind me that somewhere in this world I was truly loved, and let it remind you that no matter what becomes of me, my heart will always be yours. If I do not survive this birth, promise me you will look for the child. Do not let her grow up thinking she was unwanted. Tell her about the mountains and the ranch and the life we dreamed of building together." But Yates Sterling's father had never known about Rebecca. Her grandfather had intercepted the letters, keeping them hidden until his death 2 years ago, when Rebecca had found them while sorting through his papers. The discovery had shattered everything she thought she knew about her family, about her mother's sad eyes and her father's cold cruelty. It explained why he had looked at her sometimes with such bitter hatred, why he had tried to marry her off to a cattle baron twice her age without a shred of remorse. She was not his daughter by blood, only by the legal fiction of his marriage, and he had been counting the days until he could be rid of her. Running had been her only choice. The wedding had been set for early spring, and her father had made it clear that her wishes meant nothing to him. So Rebecca had waited until the night before the ceremony, stolen what money she could, and disappeared into the darkness with nothing but her mother's letters and the silver brand to guide her path. Now, sitting in a boarding-house room 1,000 miles from everything she had ever known, Rebecca felt the full weight of her decision settle onto her shoulders. She had no guarantee that Yates Sterling would believe her story or welcome her into his life. She had no skills beyond the basic education her mother's old governess had provided, and no prospects in a town where everyone already had their place in the social order. All she had was the truth and the brand around her neck, and she had to pray that would be enough. Morning came too quickly, bringing with it a clear sky and the sound of wagons rolling past on their way to the mines that still dotted the mountains around Julian. Rebecca dressed carefully in her best remaining dress, a deep blue cotton that had seen better days but still looked respectable, and braided her dark hair into a simple plait that hung down her back. The brand went over her dress this time, visible against the blue fabric, a statement of purpose. She was not hiding anymore. The livery stable rented her a gentle mare for the ride north, and the stableman gave her careful directions to the Silver Spur Ranch. The road wound through oak groves and past rocky outcroppings, climbing into hills covered with chaparral and the occasional stand of pine. It was beautiful country, wild and open in a way that made Rebecca's chest ache with something she could not name. This was where her mother had grown up, where she had fallen in love and made promises under these same mountains. This was the home that had been stolen from her before Rebecca was even born. The Silver Spur Ranch sprawled across a wide valley where a creek ran year-round, providing water for the hundreds of cattle that grazed the hills. The ranch house was a low, adobe structure with a deep porch and windows that caught the morning light, surrounded by corrals and outbuildings that spoke of prosperity without ostentation. Rebecca could see men working in the distance, moving cattle from one pasture to another, their shouts carrying faintly on the wind. She tied her horse at the rail in front of the house and stood for a moment, gathering her courage. Her heart hammered against her ribs, making the brand bounce slightly with each beat. This was the moment that would determine everything, whether she moved forward into a new life or found herself alone in a strange land with nowhere left to run. The door opened before she could knock, and Rebecca found herself face to face with a man who could only be Yates Sterling. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar and eyes the color of weathered denim. His face was tanned from hours in the sun, with lines around his eyes that suggested he smiled often, though he was not smiling now. He looked to be in his late 20s, perhaps 30 at most, and there was an air of quiet competence about him that reminded Rebecca of the best of her father's ranch hands, the ones who had taught her to ride and rope when she was young. "Can I help you, miss?" His voice was low and measured, polite but cautious. Strangers were not common this far from town, especially young women traveling alone. Rebecca swallowed hard and found her voice. "My name is Rebecca Torres. I have come a very long way to speak with you, Mr. Sterling, about a matter that concerns both your family and mine." He studied her face for a long moment, his expression unreadable, and then his gaze dropped to the brand hanging against her dress. She saw the exact moment recognition hit him. His eyes widened slightly, and all the color drained from his face like water from a broken dam. He reached out with one hand, gripping the doorframe as if he needed the support to stay upright. "Where did you get that?" The words came out barely above a whisper, rough with emotion she could not identify. "It was my mother's," Rebecca said, and her own voice shook despite her best efforts to stay calm. "Her name was Rose Thompson before she married. I believe your father knew her, a long time ago." Yates Sterling closed his eyes for a breath too, and when he opened them again, Rebecca saw grief and wonder warring in their depths. "Rose," he said, and the name sounded like a prayer. "My father never stopped loving her. He wore her picture next to his heart until the day he died." He stepped back, pulling the door wider. "Please, come inside. We have much to discuss." The interior of the ranch house was comfortable without being fancy, furnished with sturdy wooden pieces and colorful woven rugs that softened the tile floors. Yates led Rebecca to a sitting room where morning light streamed through west-facing windows, and gestured for her to take a seat in one of the leather chairs. He remained standing, pacing to the window and back, his hands restless at his sides. "My father told me about Rose," he said finally. "He told me everything, actually, in the weeks before he died. They met when she came to visit her aunt in San Diego, fell in love within a week, made plans to marry within a month. He had this brand made for her, a symbol that she belonged to the silver spur to him. But her father found out about the engagement and dragged her back to Texas. Within 6 months, she was married to Samuel Torres, one of the richest men in the state." His voice turned bitter. "My father tried to get her back. He rode to Texas and confronted Torres, but Rose told him she had made her choice, told him to forget about her and move on with his life. She was pregnant," Rebecca said quietly, "with me. Her father threatened to destroy your father's ranch, to ruin him completely, if she did not do as she was told. So she lied and sent him away, and she wore his brand for the rest of her life as penance." Yates turned to stare at her, and she saw her own features reflected in his face, the same dark eyes and determined chin, the same wide mouth and straight nose. They were not identical, but the family resemblance was unmistakable, the legacy of a grandmother they had shared. "You are saying Rose was your mother. That makes us half-siblings," Rebecca finished. "Your father was my father by blood, though Samuel Torres raised me as his own, or tried to anyway. He never let me forget that I was not truly his, that I was the product of my mother's sin." She pulled the letters from her bag and held them out. "I found these after my grandfather died. They explain everything." He took the letters with shaking hands and sat down heavily in the chair across from hers. Rebecca watched his face as he read, seeing the emotions play across his features like clouds across the sun. Anger, sorrow, regret, and finally, a fierce protective instinct that reminded her so much of the way her mother's old governess had looked at her that tears pricked her eyes. "He tried to marry you off," Yates said when he finished the last letter, his voice flat with suppressed rage. "You ran away the night before your wedding to a man old enough to be your grandfather." "I could not stay," Rebecca said simply. "And I had nowhere else to go except here, to find the family my mother wanted me to know. I understand if you do not wish to acknowledge the connection. I am asking nothing from you except perhaps help finding work in Julian, something that will allow me to support myself." Yates set the letters aside carefully and leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his gaze locked on hers. "You are my sister," he said, and the words carried the weight of an oath. "My father's daughter. That means you have a place here at the Silver Spur for as long as you want it." You have a home, Rebecca. You are not alone anymore." The tears she had been fighting spilled over, and Rebecca pressed her hands to her face, overwhelmed by relief and gratitude and the strange sensation of being wanted. Yates crossed the space between them and pulled her into a hug that was awkward but sincere. And for the first time since her mother died, Rebecca felt like she had found safe harbor. The days that followed were a blur of introductions and explanations. Yates took her around the ranch, introducing her to the hands who worked the spread and the housekeeper who kept the house running smoothly. Everyone accepted Yates's explanation that Rebecca was his half-sister come to live with him without question or judgment. This was California, after all, where plenty of people had complicated pasts and families that did not fit into neat categories. What mattered was that Yates claimed her as kin, and that was enough for the Silver Spur. Rebecca fell in love with the ranch almost immediately. She loved the mountains that rose behind the house like protective walls, loved the oak trees that provided shade in the heat of summer, loved the sound of the creek running over smooth stones. She loved watching the cattle graze in the golden light of evening and listening to the hands sing around the campfire at night. It was everything her mother's letters had promised and more, a place where she could finally breathe without fear. Yates gave her one of the spare bedrooms and told her to make it her own. He also gave her free run of the ranch, encouraging her to ride and explore, to learn the workings of the Silver Spur from the inside out. Rebecca threw herself into ranch life with enthusiasm, rising before dawn to help with chores, and staying up late to learn the accounting and business side of running a spread this size. She had a quick mind for figures and a natural way with horses, and Yates began to rely on her more and more as the weeks passed. It was late summer when the trouble started. One of the neighboring ranches, a sprawling operation called the Crown Royal, began pressing claims to water rights on the creek that fed the Silver Spur. The owner, a man named Howard Blackthorne, had a reputation for aggressive business tactics and a willingness to use intimidation to get what he wanted. He had been trying to buy out the smaller ranches in the valley for years, consolidating power and water access until he controlled everything from the mountains to the desert floor. Yates refused to back down. The water rights were clear, documented going back to when his father had first filed claim to the land, and he had no intention of letting Blackthorne bully him into surrendering what was legally his. But Blackthorne was not a man who accepted no for an answer, and tensions began to escalate as summer turned to fall. It was during this time that Colt Sawyer rode onto the Silver Spur looking for work. He was a cowboy in the truest sense of the word, a drifter who had worked ranches from Montana to Mexico, with skills honed by years in the saddle and a reputation for being quick with a rope and quicker with his wits. He was also, Rebecca discovered when he removed his hat in the ranch yard, the most handsome man she had ever seen. Colt stood just over 6 feet tall, with the lean, muscular build of a man who lived on horseback. His hair was the color of honey in sunlight, worn long enough to touch his collar, and his eyes were a startling shade of green that seemed to see right through whatever walls a person might try to hide behind. He had a crooked smile that suggested he found the world generally amusing, and a quiet confidence that came from knowing exactly who he was and what he was capable of doing. "Heard you might be hiring," he said to Yates, his voice carrying the slow drawl of someone who had grown up in the South but spent enough time out west to smooth the edges. "Name is Colt Sawyer. I can handle cattle, break horses, and fix just about anything that breaks. I do not drink to excess. I do not gamble what I cannot afford to lose, and I have never stolen from an employer in my life." Yates looked him over with a critical eye. You come with references. I can give you names of ranchers from here to the Rio Grande, Colt said. Though I will understand if you want to send some telegrams before you make a decision. A man should know who he is hiring on, especially in times like these. You heard about the trouble with Blackthorn. Heard some talk in Julian, Colt acknowledged. Seems like he is making a habit of pushing folks around. I do not mind standing up to bullies if that is what you are worried about, but I am a ranch hand, not a gunfighter. If you are looking to hire someone for violence, I am not your man. Yates nodded slowly, and Rebecca could see the respect in her brother's eyes. Fair enough. I can use a good hand and I will send those telegrams. In the meantime, you can bunk in the main cabin with the other hands. Pay is $30 a month plus meals and a bonus at the end of the season if we bring the cattle in healthy. Sounds more than fair. Colt extended his hand, and Yates shook it firmly. It was only then that Colt's gaze shifted to where Rebecca stood on the porch, watching the exchange with interest. Their eyes met, and Rebecca felt something electric shoot through her entire body, a jolt of recognition and attraction so powerful it left her breathless. Colt's expression shifted, the easy confidence giving way to something softer and more uncertain. He pulled his hat from his head and held it against his chest. "Madam," he said, and there was a question in his voice that Rebecca could not quite decipher. "This is my sister, Rebecca," Yates said, and Rebecca heard the warning in his tone. "She helps run the ranch with me. It is a pleasure to meet you, Miss Rebecca." Colt's eyes had not left hers, and Rebecca felt heat climb into her cheeks. She was 20 years old and had been courted by half a dozen young men back in Texas. But none of them had ever made her feel like this, like the ground had shifted beneath her feet and the world had suddenly become brighter and more dangerous all at once. "Welcome to the Silver Spur, Mr. Sawyer," she managed, and was proud that her voice came out steady. "I hope you will be happy here." "I expect I will be," he said, and the way he said it made it sound like a promise. Yates put Colt to work immediately, sending him out with the other hands to move cattle to fresh grazing. Rebecca tried not to watch him ride away, tried not to notice the easy grace with which he sat a horse or the way the sunlight caught in his hair. She had more important things to think about than a drifting cowboy with green eyes and a crooked smile. The ranch was facing real threats, and she needed to focus on helping Yates protect what their father had built. But it was hard to focus when Colt Sawyer was around. He proved himself in the first week, working harder than any two men combined, and never complaining about the long hours or difficult conditions. He had a way with the horses that bordered on magical, able to calm even the most skittish animals with nothing but his voice and his steady hands. The other hands liked him immediately, appreciating his humor and his willingness to take on the dirtiest jobs without being asked. Rebecca found excuses to be around the barns and corrals more than usual, telling herself she was just checking on the horses or reviewing the supply inventories. But the truth was she wanted to watch Colt work, wanted to hear his laugh and see the way his whole face lit up when he smiled. He treated her with perfect respect, never overstepping the bounds of propriety, but there was something in the way he looked at her that made her heart race and her stomach flip. She caught him looking at the brand around her neck one afternoon when she brought water out to the men working in the corral. His gaze lingered on the silver circle, and something complicated crossed his face before he looked away. "That is a ranch brand," he said later, when the other hands had moved on and it was just the two of them standing by the water trough. "But you wear it like jewelry." Rebecca's hand went automatically to the chain. "It belonged to my mother. It is the brand of this ranch, actually." "The Silver Spur. Your mother wore another man's brand." Colt's tone was carefully neutral, but Rebecca could hear the curiosity beneath it. She wore the brand of the man she loved, Rebecca corrected. The man who should have been my father if circumstances had been different. Now I wear it to honor her memory and the promise she made. Colt was quiet for a moment, digesting this information. Then he said, "That is a powerful thing, wearing a promise around your neck. Must be a reminder every day of what you are fighting for." "It is," Rebecca agreed. "It reminds me that love is worth fighting for, even when the world tries to tell you otherwise." Their eyes met again, and Rebecca saw something in Colt's gaze that made her breath catch. It was desire, yes, but also something deeper and more profound, a recognition that passed between them like lightning jumping from cloud to cloud. In that moment, Rebecca knew with absolute certainty that this man was going to change her life, whether she wanted him to or not. The tension with the Crown Royal reached a boiling point in October. Blackthorn's men started cutting fences and driving silver spur cattle onto Crown Royal land, then claiming the animals had wandered over of their own accord. Yates responded by posting guards on the property line and documenting every incident, building a case to take to the territorial marshal. But Blackthorn had the marshal in his pocket, and it became clear that the law was not going to provide any protection. It was Colt who suggested they take the evidence to the land office in San Diego instead, bypassing the local authorities entirely. The federal government does not take kindly to water rights disputes, he pointed out during a tense meeting in the ranch house. Especially when one party is clearly violating documented claims. If you can prove Blackthorn is stealing water and cattle, they will have to intervene. Yates seized on the idea, and plans were made for him to make the trip to San Diego with all the documentation they had gathered. But the night before he was supposed to leave, one of the line cabins caught fire, and in the chaos of fighting the blaze, 3 men were injured. Yates could not leave with his crew short-handed, and 2 of his best men laid up with burns. "I will go," Rebecca said when it became clear they had no other choice. "I know the case as well as you do, and I can present the evidence to the land office." "Absolutely not," Yates said flatly. "It is too dangerous. Blackthorn will have men watching for anyone leaving the ranch with those documents. I will not risk you getting caught in the middle of this." "Then send someone with her," Colt said quietly. Everyone turned to look at him, and he shrugged. "I know the route to San Diego, and I can make sure she gets there safely. 2 people will attract less attention than a large group, and if we travel fast, we can be there and back before Blackthorn even realizes what happened." Yates looked between Colt and Rebecca, clearly torn. Rebecca could see the calculations running behind his eyes, weighing risks against necessities. Finally, he sighed and nodded. "All right, but you take the back trails, avoid the main roads where Blackthorn's men might be watching. And Colt, if anything happens to her, you will answer to me." "Understood," Colt said seriously. "I will guard her with my life." They left before dawn the next morning, riding out under a sky full of stars that were just beginning to fade into the coming sunrise. Rebecca had changed into riding clothes, practical split skirts and a sturdy shirt, with her hair braided tight against her head. The saddlebags on her horse carried the documents and enough supplies for 3 days on the trail. Colt rode beside her on a tall bay gelding, his rifle resting across his saddle horn and his eyes constantly scanning the horizon for trouble. They made good time through the mountains, following trails that Colt seemed to know by instinct. He pointed out landmarks and told stories to pass the time, tales of his years drifting from ranch to ranch, always moving, never settling. Rebecca listened and asked questions, learning that he was 26 years old, originally from Georgia, and that he had left home at 16 after his parents died in a yellow fever outbreak. I have been on my own ever since, he said as they stopped to water the horses at a creek. Never stayed anywhere longer than a season or two. Always figured I would know the right place when I found it, but so far, nowhere has felt like home. What will you do when you find it? Rebecca asked, genuinely curious. When you find the place that feels right. Colt smiled, but there was something wistful in his expression. I suppose I will have to stop running and figure out what it means to put down roots, build something that lasts instead of just passing through other people's lives. They rode in comfortable silence after that, and Rebecca found herself thinking about what it meant to belong somewhere. She had spent her whole life in Texas feeling like an outsider, like she did not quite fit in her father's house or her father's world. But here in California, at the Silver Spur, she had finally found a place where she belonged. She could not imagine leaving it now, could not imagine going back to the rootless existence that Colt described. Night fell before they reached the halfway point, and they made camp in a grove of live oaks that provided cover from the wind. Colt built a small fire while Rebecca unpacked their supplies, and they ate a simple meal of beans and hardtack washed down with strong coffee. The stars came out in a glorious cascade overhead, so many and so bright that Rebecca felt like she could reach up and pluck them from the sky. You ever think about what your mother would say if she could see you now? Colt asked suddenly. He was sitting across the fire from her, his face half in shadow, and his voice was soft with something that might have been longing. Rebecca touched the brand at her throat. I think she would be proud, she said after a moment. I think she would be glad I found my way to the Silver Spur, that I am not letting fear or circumstances dictate my life the way she did. You are brave, Colt said. Running away the night before your wedding, traveling all the way to California alone, fighting to protect your brother's ranch. That takes courage most people do not have, or desperation, Rebecca said wryly. Sometimes they look the same from the outside. Colt shook his head. No, I have seen desperate people, and that is not you. You are someone who knows what she wants and is willing to fight for it. That is different. That is special. The way he looked at her made Rebecca's pulse quicken. There was admiration in his gaze, yes, but also something warmer and more intimate, something that made her very aware that they were alone in the wilderness with nothing but the stars for company. She should have felt afraid or at least cautious, but instead she felt safe, safer than she had ever felt with any man besides Yates. Tell me about the brand, Colt said, and it was not a command but a request, an invitation to share something personal. Tell me what it means to you. So Rebecca told him everything. She told him about finding the letters and learning the truth about her parentage, about her mother's sacrifice and her father's cruelty. She told him about wearing the brand as an act of defiance, a statement that she would never be owned or controlled by anyone. And she told him about the promise she had made to herself, that she would live the life her mother had been denied, full of love and choice and freedom. Colt listened without interrupting, his green eyes reflecting the firelight, and when she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, Your mother was a wise woman giving you that brand. It is a map and a shield all at once, showing you where to go and protecting you from being anything you do not want to be. Do you think it is strange, Rebecca asked, suddenly uncertain, wearing another man's brand like this? I think it is perfect, Colt said, and the sincerity in his voice made Rebecca's throat tight. It is a symbol of a promise kept, even when keeping it cost everything. That is not strange. That is beautiful. They talked late into the night, sharing stories and dreams and fears in the way people do, when they know they are standing at a crossroads. Rebecca told Colt about her hopes for the ranch and her determination to help Yates build something lasting. Colt told Rebecca about his loneliness, and his longing for a place to call home, for connections that went deeper than temporary employment. And beneath all the words, there was a current of growing attraction, a pull between them that felt as inevitable as the tide. When they finally settled down to sleep, Rebecca lay in her bedroll staring up at the stars and thinking about green eyes and crooked smiles. She thought about the way Colt had looked at her across the fire, like she was something precious and rare. She thought about the warmth in his voice when he called her brave, and the gentleness in his hands when he helped her down from her horse. And she thought about the fact that in 3 days they would be back at the ranch, and this strange intimacy born of campfires and shared confidences would fade back into the proper distance between employer's sister and hired hand. The thought made her chest ache in a way she did not fully understand. They reached San Diego on the afternoon of the second day, riding into the bustling port city with its mix of Mexican and American influences. The land office was a squat building near the harbor, staffed by federal clerks who seemed genuinely interested in the case Rebecca laid out before them. She presented the documentation with confidence, explaining the water rights and Blackthorn's systematic violations, and the chief clerk promised a full investigation within the week. "We will send marshals to interview witnesses and inspect the property lines," he assured her. "If what you are saying is true, Mr. Blackthorn will face serious consequences. Water theft is a federal offense." Rebecca felt a weight lift from her shoulders as they left the office. They had done it. They had bypassed Blackthorn's local influence and taken the fight to a level where justice might actually be possible. Yates would be pleased, and more importantly, the ranch would be protected. "We should celebrate," Colt said as they led their horses toward the livery. "There is a decent restaurant near the plaza, and we have time before we need to start back." They found a table in a small cafe that served a mix of Mexican and American food, and Rebecca realized she was ravenous. They ordered generously and ate with the enthusiasm of people who had been living on trail rations, laughing over plates of enchiladas and fresh tortillas. The wine Colt ordered was sweet and rich, and Rebecca felt pleasantly warm by the time they finished their meal. As they walked back toward the livery in the gathering dusk, Colt caught her hand, his fingers lacing through hers. Rebecca's heart jumped, but she did not pull away. It felt right, natural, like they had been holding hands for years instead of days. "Rebecca," Colt said, and then stopped, seeming to struggle with his words. They had reached a small plaza with a fountain in the center, and he pulled her to a stop beside the water. "I need to tell you something, and I do not know if this is the right time or place, but I cannot keep it to myself anymore." "What is it?" Rebecca asked, though part of her already knew, could feel the truth in the way he held her hand and looked at her like she held the answers to every question he had ever asked. "I have been a drifter my whole adult life," Colt said. "Never stayed anywhere because nowhere felt worth staying for. But then I rode onto the Silver Spur and met you, and everything changed. You changed everything, Rebecca. When I look at you, I see home. I see the future I always wanted but never thought I could have. And I know it has only been a few weeks, and I know I am just a hired hand with nothing to offer but a good work ethic and a decent reputation, but I am falling in love with you. I think I have been falling since the moment I first saw you standing on that porch." Rebecca's breath caught and she felt tears prick her eyes. "Colt, you do not have to say anything," he said quickly. "I just needed you to know, needed you to understand why I look at you the way I do, why I volunteered to make this trip even though I knew it would be dangerous. Being near you is worth any risk." "You are wrong about one thing," Rebecca said, and her voice shook with the force of her emotions. "You are wrong when you say you have nothing to offer. You have everything I want, Colt. You have kindness and courage and a good heart. You have made me feel safe and seen in a way I never have before, and I am falling in love with you too. I think I have been falling since you first took off your hat in the ranch yard." Colt's face transformed, joy breaking across it like sunrise. He pulled her closer, his free hand coming up to cup her cheek, and Rebecca leaned into the touch, her eyes fluttering closed. "Can I kiss you?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "Yes," Rebecca whispered, and then his lips were on hers, soft and warm and perfect. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, but it quickly deepened as weeks of suppressed attraction and growing affection poured out between them. Rebecca wrapped her arms around Colt's neck, pressing closer, and felt his arms circle her waist, holding her like she was something infinitely precious. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Colt rested his forehead against hers. "I want to do this right," he said. "I want to court you properly, with your brother's permission and everyone knowing my intentions. I want to build a life with you, Rebecca. I want to stop drifting and put down roots at the Silver Spur if you will have me." "I will have you," Rebecca said, and laughed through her tears. "I will absolutely have you." They kissed again under the stars, beside the fountain in a plaza in San Diego, and Rebecca felt the last piece of her broken heart slot into place. She had run from Texas seeking freedom and family, but she had found so much more. She had found love, real and true and worth fighting for, the kind of love her mother had written about in her letters, the kind of love that was worth any sacrifice. The ride back to the Silver Spur took 2 days, but it felt like hours. Rebecca and Colt talked constantly, making plans and sharing dreams, their hands linked whenever the trail was wide enough to ride side by side. They spoke of the future with a certainty that would have seemed foolish weeks ago, but now felt like the only reasonable course. They would marry, they decided, as soon as Colt could speak to Yates and make his intentions clear. They would build a house on the ranch, somewhere with a view of the mountains, and fill it with children and laughter. Colt would work his way up from hired hand to foreman to partner, proving his worth through dedication and skill. Rebecca would continue helping manage the ranch, using her sharp mind for figures and her growing knowledge of cattle and land management. It was a good plan, a solid plan, the kind of plan that took into account the realities of ranch life while still leaving room for love and happiness. Rebecca touched the brand at her throat often during those 2 days, thinking about her mother and the choices that had shaped both their lives. Rose Thompson had worn this brand as a symbol of lost love and broken promises, but Rebecca would wear it as a symbol of love found and promises kept. She would honor her mother's memory by living the life Rose had been denied, by choosing love over duty and happiness over security. When they rode into the ranch yard late on the second day, Yates was waiting on the porch. He took one look at their faces, at the way they sat their horses close together and the way their eyes sought each other constantly, and his expression shifted from relief to understanding to something that might have been resignation. "You made it back safely," he said, coming down the steps. "The land office agreed to investigate." "They did," Rebecca confirmed, sliding down from her horse. "They are sending marshals within the week. We should have resolution soon." "Good. That is very good." Yates looked at Colt, and something passed between the two men, some silent communication that Rebecca could not quite read. "Mr. Sawyer, would you join me in the study? I believe we have some things to discuss." Colt nodded and dismounted, handing his reins to one of the hands who had come to take the horses. He squeezed Rebecca's hand once, a quick reassurance, and then followed Yates into the house. Rebecca paced the porch for the next 30 minutes, her stomach in knots. She trusted Yates to be reasonable, but she also knew he took his role as her protector seriously. If he objected to her relationship with Colt, if he thought it was too fast or inappropriate, he might refuse to give his blessing. And while Rebecca was prepared to defy him if necessary, she desperately wanted his approval. Yates was the only family she had, and the thought of creating friction between them over this made her chest tight with anxiety. When the study door finally opened, both men emerged looking serious but not angry. Yates caught Rebecca's eye and gestured for her to join them. "Colt has told me about his feelings for you," Yates said without preamble once the study door closed behind them. "And he has asked my permission to court you with the intention of marriage." Rebecca's heart hammered. "And what did you say?" "I told him that you are a grown woman who makes her own choices, and that my permission is not actually required," Yates said. "But I also told him that if he ever hurts you or treats you with anything less than the respect you deserve, I will personally make his life very difficult." Colt smiled slightly. He was very descriptive about exactly how difficult. "I just want you to be happy," Yates continued, his gaze softening as he looked at Rebecca. "And it is clear that Colt makes you happy. I have watched you over the past few weeks, seen the way you light up when he is around. I would be a fool to stand in the way of that. So yes, you have my blessing, both of you, but I expect a proper engagement, nothing rushed. Give yourselves time to be sure this is what you both want." "Thank you," Rebecca said and threw her arms around her brother's neck. "Thank you, Yates." He hugged her back, tight enough that she could barely breathe. "Just be happy," he murmured against her hair. "That is all I have ever wanted for you." The engagement was announced the next day, and if anyone on the ranch was surprised by the speed of the courtship, they kept it to themselves. Cowboys were not generally given to lengthy romantic pursuits, and a man who knew what he wanted and went after it was respected rather than criticized. The Hands liked Colt and they liked Rebecca, and the general consensus was that they made a good match. The federal marshals arrived a week later and spent 3 days investigating Blackthorn's operation. What they found was damning: systematic fence cutting, illegal water diversion, and cattle theft on a scale that went far beyond simple boundary disputes. Blackthorn was arrested and his ranch placed under federal oversight pending trial. The Crown Royal's foreman, eager to avoid prosecution himself, testified that Blackthorn had been planning to drive the Silver Spur out of business and then buy the land for pennies on the dollar. The testimony vindicated everything Yates had claimed, and the marshals issued a formal apology for the local corruption that had allowed the situation to escalate. Water rights were confirmed in writing, boundaries were resurveyed and properly marked, and the Silver Spur was awarded damages to compensate for the stolen cattle and destroyed property. It was a complete victory, the kind that would have seemed impossible just months ago. Rebecca and Colt were married in early December, in a small ceremony held at the ranch with the Hands and a few friends from Julian in attendance. Rebecca wore a simple dress of cream-colored silk that Yates had ordered specially from San Francisco, and she wore her mother's brand openly, the silver circle gleaming against the pale fabric. Colt wore his best shirt and a new vest, and when he saw Rebecca walking toward him across the ranch yard, his eyes filled with tears. The ceremony was performed by a circuit preacher who rode through the area once a month, and the vows they exchanged were traditional but heartfelt. When Colt slipped a gold band onto Rebecca's finger, she felt the weight of it like a promise made solid, a symbol of the life they were building together. And when the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Colt kissed her with such tenderness that several of the Hands had to wipe their eyes. The celebration that followed was loud and joyful, with music and dancing and more food than seemed possible. Someone had rigged up a platform for dancing, and Colt swept Rebecca into his arms as the fiddles started up, spinning her around until she was dizzy and laughing. They danced until the stars came out, and then they slipped away to the small house Yates had given them as a wedding gift, a cozy cabin near the creek with a view of the mountains. Inside, with the door closed against the cold December night, Colt took Rebecca in his arms and kissed her slowly, thoroughly, with all the passion they had been carefully restraining. "I love you," he murmured against her lips. "I love you so much it scares me sometimes." "Do not be scared," Rebecca whispered back. "We are going to have a beautiful life together. I can feel it." And they did. The years that followed were full of hard work and hard-won happiness, of building something lasting on the foundation of love and trust. Colt proved himself invaluable to the ranch, working his way up to foreman within 2 years and becoming Yates's full partner shortly after. He had a gift for breeding horses, and the Silver Spur became known throughout California for producing strong, intelligent animals that could work cattle all day without complaint. Rebecca managed the business side of the ranch, keeping the books and negotiating contracts with buyers in San Diego and Los Angeles. She also became involved in the growing community around Julian, helping establish a school and a library, fighting for better roads and mail service. She wore her mother's brand every day, a reminder of where she came from and what she had overcome, and people came to recognize it as a symbol of the Silver Spur's integrity and success. Their first child was born in the fall of 1880, a sturdy boy they named Wyatt after Colt's father. He had Colt's green eyes and Rebecca's dark hair, and from the moment he could sit a horse, it was clear he had inherited his parents' love for ranch life. 2 years later came a daughter they named Rose, for Rebecca's mother, who had her father's sunny disposition and her mother's sharp mind. And 3 years after that came another boy, James, who was quiet and thoughtful and showed an early talent for working with his hands. The children grew up wild and happy, running through the oak groves and splashing in the creek, learning to ride before they could properly read and absorbing the rhythms of ranch life like other children absorbed nursery rhymes. Rebecca watched them grow with a contentment she had never imagined possible back in Texas, when her whole world had been fear and obligation. This was what her mother had wanted for her, this freedom and joy and love that filled every corner of her life. Yates never married, claiming he was too set in his ways to make a good husband, but he was a devoted uncle who spoiled the children shamelessly and taught them everything he knew about cattle and land management. He aged well, growing into the kind of rancher people looked up to and respected, known for his fairness and his willingness to help neighbors in trouble. The Silver Spur prospered under his leadership and Colt's management, expanding carefully over the years until it was one of the most successful operations in San Diego County. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Colt took Rebecca to the same plaza in San Diego where they had first kissed, now with 3 children in tow and a decade of shared history behind them. They sat by the fountain while the children played, and Colt took Rebecca's hand just as he had that first night. "You remember what I told you here?" he asked, his green eyes warm with affection. "About falling in love with you." "I remember everything," Rebecca said, squeezing his fingers. "I remember thinking that my whole life had led me to that moment to you." "I see you still wear the brand," Colt said, touching the silver circle at her throat. "After all these years." "I will always wear it," Rebecca said. "It reminds me of my mother's courage and her sacrifice. It reminds me that love is worth fighting for, even when the fight seems impossible. And it reminds me that I belong to the Silver Spur, to this land and this life and you." Colt pulled her close, heedless of the children playing nearby or the people passing through the plaza. "You know what I see when I look at that brand now," he said softly. "I see a woman who chose her own path, who refused to let anyone else define her worth or her future. I see the woman I love, who wears her past as armor and her dreams as wings. And I see the mother of my children, the partner in my life, the reason I finally stopped running and learned to call a place home." Rebecca kissed him, tasting salt from her own tears. "The cowboy knew he was already hers," she whispered, echoing a phrase Colt had used once, years ago, when explaining to Yates why he had fallen so fast and so hard. "From the first moment," Colt agreed. "From the very first moment I saw you standing on that porch, I knew my running days were over. I was yours before you even knew my name." They sat together by the fountain as the sun set over San Diego, their children's laughter ringing through the plaza like bells, and Rebecca thought about the journey that had brought her here. She thought about the frightened girl who had fled Texas in the dark of night, about the letters that had led her to California, and the brother who had welcomed her home. She thought about her mother and the promises made and broken, about the silver brand that had guided her path like a star in the darkness. And she thought about the cowboy who had ridden into her life on an autumn day and shown her what it meant to be truly loved, not as property or possession, but as an equal and a partner. Colt had given her everything she had dreamed of, and things she had not known to dream about, a life full of purpose and passion and bone-deep satisfaction. The years continued to roll by with the steady inevitability of seasons changing. Wyatt grew into a young man who looked so much like his father that strangers sometimes mistook them for brothers, and he showed the same steady competence and quiet confidence that had made Colt such a valued member of the ranch. Rose became a force of nature, beautiful and brilliant and absolutely fearless, with a talent for training horses that surpassed even her father's considerable skill. And James, quiet James, developed a gift for carpentry and metalwork that led him to design and build innovations that made ranch work easier and more efficient. Rebecca watched her children grow with pride and satisfaction, knowing that they were being raised with the freedom and choices she had been denied. They would never know what it was like to be considered property or to have their futures dictated by the ambitions of cruel men. They would grow up understanding that love was a choice, not an obligation, and that their worth was inherent, not determined by birth or circumstance. The turn of the century brought changes to California and to Julian. The mines began to play out, and the town slowly transformed from a rough mining camp into a proper agricultural community. The railroad reached San Diego, making it easier to ship cattle and horses to markets throughout the West. New ranches sprang up in the valleys and hills, and the Silver Spur became a model for how to run a successful operation while maintaining good relationships with neighbors and hands. Yates passed away peacefully in his sleep in 1905, at the age of 53. He left the ranch to Rebecca and Colt jointly, along with a letter that brought tears to Rebecca's eyes. In it, he thanked her for finding him, for bringing light and purpose back into his life after their father's death. He wrote that knowing her, watching her build a life with Colt and raise her children on the land their father had loved, had been the greatest joy of his later years. And he told her that he hoped she understood how proud their father would have been of her, of the woman she had become, and the legacy she was creating. Rebecca wore black for a year, mourning the brother who had given her everything when she had nothing. But she also took comfort in knowing that Yates had died happy, surrounded by family and secure in the knowledge that the Silver Spur would continue to thrive. She buried him on a hill overlooking the ranch, under an oak tree where he used to sit and watch the cattle graze, and she made sure his headstone bore the words "beloved brother," "faithful friend," "keeper of promises." As the children grew into adults and began to make their own paths, Rebecca and Colt found themselves with more time to simply enjoy each other's company. They took long rides through the mountains, revisiting the places they had camped on that first journey to San Diego. They traveled to San Francisco and Los Angeles, experiencing the growing sophistication of California's cities, while always being glad to return to the quiet beauty of the ranch. And they spent countless evenings sitting on their porch, watching the sun set over the mountains and marveling at how far they had come from the people they had been when they first met. Wyatt married a schoolteacher from Julian and built a house on the eastern edge of the ranch, where he managed the cattle operation with the same steady competence his father had shown. Rose shocked everyone by falling in love with a horse buyer from Kentucky, a charming man with impeccable manners who treated her like a queen and genuinely appreciated her independent spirit. They divided their time between California and Kentucky, breeding horses that commanded top dollar throughout the country. And James, sweet James, married his childhood sweetheart and set up a workshop where he continued to design and build innovations that made ranch life easier. The grandchildren came in a steady stream over the next decade, filling the ranch with noise and energy. Rebecca delighted in her role as grandmother, teaching the children to ride and telling them stories about their great-grandmother Rose, who had loved so deeply and sacrificed so much. She made sure each of them understood the significance of the brand she still wore, explaining that it represented not just a ranch or a family, but a promise that love could overcome any obstacle if people were brave enough to fight for it. Colt aged gracefully, his honey-colored hair turning silver at the temples and then completely white, his face weathering into lines that spoke of a life spent outdoors and laughing often. He never lost his crooked smile or the way his green eyes lit up when he looked at Rebecca, and he told her at least once a day that he loved her, that she was the best thing that had ever happened to him. On their 30th anniversary, he had a new brand made, a small silver circle identical to the one Rebecca wore, and he wore it on a chain around his own neck. "Now we both carry the promise," he said when he showed her. "Both of us marked by the silver spur and by each other." Rebecca cried happy tears and kissed him until they were both breathless. "You did not need a brand to mark yourself as mine," she said. "You have always been mine from the first moment." "And you have always been mine," Colt replied. "But I wanted the symbol, wanted something tangible to remind me every day of the promises we made and kept. Your mother started a legacy when she wore this brand, Rebecca. She showed that love could survive even when everything else was taken away. And we continued that legacy, proved that choosing love over duty was not weakness, but the greatest strength anyone could have." They stood together on their porch, wearing matching brands and surrounded by the evidence of a life well lived, and Rebecca felt a peace so profound it was almost painful. She had done what she set out to do all those years ago when she fled Texas with nothing but her mother's letters and a desperate hope. She had honored Rose Thompson's memory by living freely and loving fully. She had built something lasting on the foundation of her mother's sacrifice. And she had proved that the promises made in darkness could bloom into joy when given the chance to take root in good soil. The ranch continued to prosper as new generations took over its management. Wyatt proved to be as good a rancher as his father and uncle, with a gift for breeding cattle that produced stronger, healthier stock. Rose's horses became legendary throughout the West, sought after by everyone from working cowboys to wealthy sportsmen. and James's innovations were copied by ranches across California, improving efficiency and reducing the backbreaking labor that had always been part of ranch life. Rebecca and Colt stepped back from active management in their 60s, content to advise and support while their children ran the day-to-day operations. They spent their time traveling to visit Rose in Kentucky, doting on grandchildren and working on projects that interested them. Rebecca wrote a history of the Silver Spur and the Sterling family, ensuring that future generations would know the story of Rose Thompson and the love that had shaped their family's destiny. Colt finally had time to pursue his passion for woodworking, creating beautiful furniture that became family treasures. On a spring morning in 1920, Rebecca woke to find Colt standing at their bedroom window, looking out at the mountains with an expression of such contentment that it made her heart ache. She rose and joined him, slipping her arms around his waist and resting her cheek against his back. "What are you thinking about?" she asked softly. "I am thinking that I am the luckiest man who ever lived," Colt said, turning to fold her into his embrace. "I am thinking that 40 years ago I rode onto this ranch looking for work, and I found everything I ever wanted. I found home and family and purpose. I found you." "We found each other," Rebecca corrected, tilting her face up for a kiss. "And we built something beautiful together." "We did," Colt agreed. "We took the promise your mother made and honored it by living the life she dreamed of. We turned pain into joy and loss into legacy. And I would not change a single moment of it, not even the hard times, because they all led us here." They stood together in the morning light, two people who had found each other against all odds and built a love that had lasted through decades and challenges, and the simple wear of time. The silver brands they wore caught the sunlight, gleaming with the same steady shine they had possessed when Rose Thompson first put one on so many years ago. The promise had been kept, passed down through generations, transformed from symbol of loss to symbol of triumph. Rebecca thought about the frightened girl who had fled Texas, about the long journey to California, and the uncertainty of what she would find. She thought about the moment she first saw Colt, the electricity that had passed between them, the slow building of trust and affection into something unbreakable. And she thought about all the years since, the children raised and grandchildren born, the ranch built into something that would last for generations. "No regrets?" Colt asked, as if reading her thoughts. "Not a single one," Rebecca said firmly. "This is the life I was meant to live, and you are the man I was meant to love. Everything that came before was just the path leading me to you." They kissed in the morning light, surrounded by the life they had built, and Rebecca felt the circle close. Her mother's story had ended in tragedy, but Rebecca's story had ended in triumph. The brand that had symbolized loss and sacrifice now symbolized love and choice, and the power of promises kept. And the cowboy who had known he was hers from the first moment had proved it every day since, through actions and words, and the steady devotion of a man who had finally found his home. The years continued in their gentle progression, marked by seasons and celebrations, by births and deaths, and all the ordinary miracles of a life well lived. Rebecca and Colt grew old together with grace and gratitude, their love deepening rather than diminishing with time. They saw their grandchildren grow and marry and have children of their own, creating a fourth generation to carry on the Sterling name and the Silver Spur legacy. On their 50th wedding anniversary, the family gathered at the ranch for a celebration that drew people from across California and beyond. Wyatt and his wife came with their 5 children and growing collection of grandchildren. Rose and her husband traveled from Kentucky with their brood, filling the ranch house with laughter and stories. James and his family completed the gathering, 3 generations of Sterlings and Sawyers coming together to honor the love that had started it all. The celebration was held on a perfect December day, 50 years to the day after Rebecca and Colt had spoken their vows in this same ranch yard. A platform had been erected for dancing, just like the original wedding, and the food tables groaned under the weight of contributed dishes. Neighbors and friends came from Julian and beyond, testament to the respect and affection the family had earned over the decades. Rebecca wore a new dress for the occasion, a soft blue silk that complemented her silver hair, and of course, she wore her mother's brand. Colt wore his best suit, the silver at his temples making his green eyes even more striking, and his matching brand gleamed against his white shirt. They stood together, receiving congratulations and well wishes, their hands linked the way they had been for 5 decades, and both of them struggled not to cry from sheer happiness. When it came time for dancing, Colt swept Rebecca into his arms just as he had 50 years before, moving with less speed perhaps, but no less grace. They waltzed across the platform while their family and friends watched and applauded, 2 people who had built a life on the foundation of love and never looked back. 50 years, Colt murmured against Rebecca's hair. 50 years, and I love you more now than I did the day we married. That is because love grows, Rebecca said. It does not stay static. Every challenge we faced together, every joy we shared, every ordinary moment of just being together, all of it added to what we have. We did not just maintain our love, Colt. We cultivated it, nurtured it, let it grow into something bigger and stronger than either of us alone. You are the wisest woman I have ever known, Colt said, and kissed her forehead. And I am grateful every single day that you chose me. You are the kindest man I have ever known, Rebecca replied. And choosing you was the easiest decision I ever made. The party lasted late into the night, with music and dancing and storytelling that spanned 5 decades of memories. Grandchildren begged for tales of the old days, when Grandma had run away from Texas, and Grandpa had been a drifting cowboy. Rebecca and Colt obliged, painting pictures with words of a wilder time, when the West was still being settled and love stories unfolded against backdrops of cattle drives and frontier justice. When the last guests finally departed, and the family settled into the various beds scattered throughout the house and outbuildings, Rebecca and Colt returned to their own small cabin by the creek. They sat on their porch as they had countless times before, watching the stars come out over the mountains, listening to the water running over stones. "You think your mother would be proud?" Colt asked into the comfortable silence. Rebecca touched the brand at her throat, feeling its familiar weight. "I know she would be," she said with conviction. "I know she would look at this life, at our family and the ranch and everything we built, and she would know that her sacrifice was not in vain. I got to live the life she dreamed of, Colt. I got to choose love and freedom and build something lasting. That is what she wanted for me, what she wore this brand to remind herself was worth fighting for. Then we succeeded," Colt said simply. "We took the pain of the past and transformed it into joy for the future. That is the best revenge against all the people who tried to control you, who thought they could own you. You proved them wrong in the most spectacular way possible." Rebecca laughed and leaned her head on his shoulder. "We proved them wrong," she corrected. "This was never just my journey, Colt. From the moment you rode onto the silver spur, it became our journey. You gave me the courage to believe I deserved happiness. You showed me what it meant to be loved without conditions or control. And you proved that promises could be kept, that love could last, that 2 people who found each other against all odds could build something that endures. They sat together under the stars, two people who had weathered 50 years of marriage and emerged stronger for it. They had faced droughts and financial hardships, illness and loss, all the ordinary and extraordinary challenges that life threw at people who dared to build something lasting. And they had faced them together, drawing strength from each other and from the love that had brought them together in the first place. As the years advanced into their 70s, and then their 80s, Rebecca and Colt slowed down but never stopped finding joy in each other's company. They spent their days in gentle routines, tending a small garden, reading to each other on the porch, taking short walks through the oak groves where they had once ridden. Their children and grandchildren visited often, bringing life and energy into their quiet world, and they delighted in watching the Silver Spur continue to thrive under new management. Rebecca continued to wear her mother's brand every day, the silver growing soft and worn from decades against her skin. It had become such a part of her that she felt naked without it, as if removing the chain would somehow disconnect her from everything that had made her who she was. Colt's matching brand showed similar wear, both of them marked by time and love and the steady keeping of promises. On a summer evening in 1930, as the sun set in brilliant shades of gold and crimson over the mountains, Rebecca and Colt sat together on their porch for what would be the last time. They did not know it was the last time, of course. They simply sat as they had thousands of times before, holding hands and watching the day fade into night. "I have had a good life," Colt said softly. "The best life. Thank you for sharing it with me." "Thank you for giving it to me," Rebecca replied, squeezing his fingers. "Thank you for seeing me when I was invisible, for loving me when I felt unlovable, for building this beautiful life with me." "Always," Colt promised. "Always and forever." Those were the last words they spoke before Colt's heart, which had beaten steady and true for 82 years, finally gave out. He went peacefully, his hand in Rebecca's, his eyes on the mountains he loved, surrounded by the life he had built. Rebecca held him and wept, but even through her grief, she felt gratitude for the decades they had shared and the love that had sustained them. She wore black to his funeral and stood dry-eyed as they buried him on the hill next to Yates, under an oak tree with a view of the entire valley. The whole town turned out to pay their respects, testimony to the man Colt had been and the impact he had made. Rebecca accepted condolences with grace, but inside she felt hollow, as if part of her soul had been buried with her husband. The weeks after Colt's death were the hardest of Rebecca's life, harder even than fleeing Texas or facing down an uncertain future. She had spent 52 years with Colt at her side, and his absence left a void that nothing could fill. But she had her family, her children and grandchildren who rallied around her with love and support, and she had the ranch, the legacy they had built together. Rebecca lived for another 3 years after Colt's passing, years spent surrounded by family and memories. She continued to wear both her brand and Colt's, the two silver circles resting side by side against her chest, symbols of promises made and kept. She spent her time writing letters to her grandchildren and great-grandchildren, sharing stories and wisdom, making sure the family history was preserved for future generations. And she spent long hours sitting on her porch, remembering and grieving and gradually finding peace. On a spring morning in 1933, Rebecca Torres Sawyer passed away quietly in her sleep, surrounded by photographs of her family and wearing the brands that had guided her life. She was 85 years old, and she died knowing she had lived fully and loved completely, that she had honored her mother's sacrifice and built a legacy that would endure. They buried her next to Colt on the hill under the oak trees, and 3 generations of Sterlings and Sawyers gathered to say goodbye. The headstone bore simple words chosen from her letters. She wore his brand and chose her own path. Beloved wife, mother, grandmother, keeper of promises. The Silver Spur Ranch continued to thrive, passing through generations of the family Rebecca and Colt had created. The brands they had worn were preserved as family treasures, displayed in the ranch house as reminders of the love story that had shaped the sterling legacy. And every new bride who married into the family was told the story of Rose Thompson and Rebecca Torres, of the promises made and kept, of the cowboy who knew he was already hers from the first moment. The story became legend in Julian and the surrounding valleys, a tale of love and courage that inspired new generations to believe in the power of choice and the strength of promises kept. The Silver Spur became known not just for its cattle and horses, but for the values it represented: integrity, hard work, and above all, the belief that love was the foundation on which everything worthwhile was built. Years turned into decades, and the 20th century rolled forward with its wars and changes and technological revolutions. But on a hillside in San Diego County, under oak trees that had witnessed 100 years of sterling family history, 3 headstones stood as testimony to a love story that had started with a stolen brand and ended with a legacy that would never fade. Rose Thompson, who had worn a promise until her dying day. Rebecca Torres Sawyer, who had honored that promise by living the life her mother had been denied. And Colt Sawyer, the drifting cowboy who had found his home and proved that sometimes the best promises were the ones we did not know we were making. The ranch still stands today, run by descendants who carry the sterling name and the legacy of love and determination that built it. And in the ranch house, carefully preserved behind glass, hang 2 silver brands on delicate chains. They are worn smooth from decades against skin, but the circle remains unbroken, symbol of promises that endure beyond time and circumstance. The story of how those brands came to hang there, of the woman who fled Texas and the cowboy who knew he was hers, of the brother who welcomed her home and the family that grew from love rather than obligation. That story is told to every new generation. It reminds them that the choices made by those who came before shaped the world they inherited, and that their own choices will shape the world to come. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the sun sets over the Cuyamaca Mountains in brilliant shades of gold and crimson, people swear they can see 2 figures sitting on a porch by the creek, holding hands and watching the light fade. They say it is just shadows and wishful thinking, tricks of the light on old wood and stone. But the children of the Silver Spur know better. They know that some loves are strong enough to outlast even death, that promises kept have power beyond imagining, and that the best stories never really end. They just transform, generation by generation, into new chapters of an ongoing tale of courage and choice, and the enduring power of love freely given and gratefully received. The brands remain as testimony, silver circles that carry the weight of history and the lightness of hope, reminding everyone who sees them that the greatest legacy anyone can leave is proof that they loved well and lived fully and kept their promises until the very end.